These are all the finished blocks from our 2024 to 2025 Time to Bloom Mystery Quilt-as-you-go course. There's 12 applique blocks and 13 patchwork blocks, and they're all quilted together with the batting and backing fabric. When all 25 blocks are joined together, they'll become a queen-size quilt that measures 80 inches square. This is part one of a three-part series where we're going to get started with joining the blocks into rows using my easy cover strip method. For this quilt, we're going to put the cover strips on the back to give a no sashing look on the front. However, if you prefer the look of sashing between the blocks, do the reverse to what I show in this video and put the cover strips on the front. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to trim the blocks, how to make the cover strips, and how to join the blocks together into rows. So let's get started. Here's what you'll need: cutting mat, ruler, and a rotary cutter with a fresh sharp blade, 50 centimeters or half a yard of a medium weight opaque interfacing to make the template, a sharp pencil, flathead pins, some weights. I'm using 4 small tins of tuna from my pantry, spray starch, a 1-inch bias maker, a fabric marker that can be easily removed from the fabric, water-soluble, acid-free and non-toxic glue. I'm using Elmer's school glue. You'll also need painters or masking tape. Quilter's clips are handy, although not essential. A walking foot, thread to match your top background fabric, and of course, your sewing machine. And a disclaimer, you should always test any glues or fabric markers before using them to make your quilt. You can position the blocks in any way that you like. We decided to swap the poinsettia block with the rose block just to balance out the flowers. For our Time to Bloom course members, we've created a numbered plan for the quilt, so you can cut those numbers out and pin them onto the quilt blocks. There's also a plan for a 12-block quilt and a blank plan for those that are making a different amount of blocks to what we're making. Using flathead pins, pin the paper numbers onto the center of each block with the numbers pinned in the upright position. This is important, and I'll explain why in the next step. There are 2 steps to trimming the blocks. The first step is to trim them to 16 3/4 inches square. This will allow a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on all 4 sides of each block. A 3/8 seam allowance is used because it's easier to press open and will sit nice and flat. So once the seams are sewn, the finished size of each block is 16 inches square. The second step is to trim the batting away from the edges that will join to another edge. With this quilt, the batting will remain level with the edges that are on the perimeter of the quilt. This is so the quilt can be finished with a regular binding, or it can be extended with the easy border method, as both these options require the batting to be level with the outer edge of the quilt. You'll notice that the paper numbers indicate which blocks are positioned on the perimeter. This is why it's important to make sure that the numbers are pinned in the upright position. I also like to do this with flathead pins because the pins will sit flat under the ruler when trimming. The easiest way to trim the blocks is to make a template, and I'm going to do this with the medium weight opaque interfacing. To get started, find the straight edge of the interfacing. Measure and mark 16 3/4 inches away from the straight edge. Do this in 2 places. A tip is to use a very sharp marker and to angle the marker in towards the edge of the ruler for an accurate measurement. Now connect the 2 marks with your ruler and cut. Rotate the interfacing and square the edge by making sure that one of the horizontal straight edges is aligned with a straight line on the ruler. Now measure 16 3/4 inches away from the square edge and mark in 2 places. Once again, connect the marks and cut. You will now have a 16 3/4 inch square. Mark a center line by measuring 8 3/8 from one edge. Mark in 2 places, then connect the marks with the ruler and draw a line. Rotate the template and mark another center line in the same way. Next, mark a 1 3/8 inch border around the edge of the square. This line will help to keep the border seams of the patchwork blocks even. And here is our 16 3/4 inch template. Double check to make sure that your template is accurate by folding it in half both vertically and horizontally to make sure that your center lines are correct. To make sure that the template is square, fold it in half on the diagonal. Let's start by trimming a patchwork block that has center seams. This is easy because all you have to do is line up the center lines of the template with the center seams of the block. Then double check that the border seams are as even as they can be with the marked border lines. Just as a side note, each patchwork block has a border sewn around the edge in the background fabric. This was a safety measure just in case the patchwork block finished smaller than 14.5 inches square. So some border strips may be slightly wider to compensate for the loss of size in the patchwork block. However, there is so much to look at with this quilt and no one will notice the borders as they're just going to blend into the background fabric. When the template is in position, hold in place with the flathead pins and trim around the edge with a patchwork ruler and rotary cutter. The next step is to trim the batting. The numbered label indicates that the batting must be trimmed on all edges as this is one of the inner blocks. Fold the top fabric and the backing fabric back to expose the batting. Pin the top and the backing fabric away from the batting. To keep the edge of the batting straight, align it with a line on your cutting mat. Now place the 3/8 inch line of the ruler on the edge of the batting and trim. Do this to the other 3 edges of the block. To trim a patchwork block that doesn't have a center seam, use the border lines of the template. Align the border lines with the border seams, once again making them as even as possible. Now every time you quilt something, it can shrink and distort slightly, so don't expect perfection here, just do your best. Smooth the block out and pull it into shape if necessary. Use the weights to hold the template in place, then when you're happy with the position, pin it in place. Now trim around the edge of the template. Trim the batting in the same way. As this block is a corner block, you only need to trim the batting on 2 edges. Now let's trim an applique block. If you remember in the first applique block, I mentioned marking the center points on the outer edges of the block. So all you have to do is line up the center lines of the template with the marked lines, and you'll see that there is a space of about 1/2 inch around the edge of the template. Trim the block in the same way, then trim the batting. If you forgot to mark the halfway points on your applique blocks, don't worry because I did the same thing. It's just a matter of placing the template on top, making sure that there's an approximate 1/2 inch extending past the edge of the template. Also make sure that the design is centered under the template and that any of those quilted dandelions are inside the template edge. Once again, trim the block in the same way, then trim the batting. So a couple of tips. If you find it hard to see the edge of the template because you have a light background fabric, you can always make your template from a coloured tissue paper. And halfway through trimming the batting, I realised instead of pinning that using clips to hold the top fabric and the backing fabric away from the batting is also a good idea. As I always say, do what works best for you. So make yourself a cuppa, put on some music and finish trimming the blocks. They look so good. I'm really excited to start joining them together today.
Mum.
What?
I'm setting up a test shot.
That's okay. It's day 2. Time to join the blocks together. Let's get started.
Day 2.
After pinning it with pins, I decided to use clips and I just position them in exactly the same way. Set your machine up with a neutral colour thread on top and in the bobbin. Insert a size 80 or 90 quilting needle. Set your machine to a straight stitch with a length of 3 and attach your walking foot. As mentioned, the blocks are joined together with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I recommend marking a seam guide with masking tape or painter's tape. This line indicates the position of the needle when it's in the centre, and here's my tape positioned 3/8 of an inch away from this line. As quilters, we're used to always sewing with a 1/4 inch, so the tape will also be a good reminder for you to remember to take that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance when joining the blocks together. So let's join the first row together. Take block 1 and block 2 and place them with the tops facing. You can either hold them together with pins or quilt clips. When I pin, I like to place them acrossways and pin one at the top, one at the bottom, and then some pins in between. I position the quilt clips in the same way. When you go to sew, line the fabric up with the tape and start a 1/4 inch down from the top edge. To secure, reverse a few stitches, then sew forwards. As you sew, you may feel the foot push away from the raised surface of the batting, but hold the fabric straight and continue sewing with that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to the end of the seam, finish with a reverse stitch. Now it's okay if some of the batting is caught in the seam, and this is why I recommend using a low loft batting.
That was pretty easy.
It is, isn't it? So you can see it's nice and neat on the front, and on the back we have the raw seam, and that raw seam is going to be pressed open and covered with the cover strip in a future step. Continue sewing the blocks together in this way to make 5 rows of 5 blocks, pressing the seams open. As mentioned, the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance will sit nice and flat. These raw seams will be covered with the cover strip in the next step.
Wow. You know what? You're convincing me that that looks pretty easy. Like I could even make a quilt.
You could, definitely. Anyone can. I think just the trick is to be patient and not rush, and don't realize that everything has to be done so fast. Just enjoy it. one row down. Now it's time to press the seams.
This setup is not OH&S. Is this a 3-step pressing technique?
No, this one isn't. This one we're just going to open the seam and press it, and you'll see that because the batting is not in the seam is going to press nice and flat. And to celebrate joining this quilt together, I bought a new iron and it's full of water, and I'm going to use steam just to make sure that I get a very nice flat seam.
Steam in the same water tube.
Look at that. Let's have a little peek from the front. Ah, looking lovely.
Wow, that's magic.
It is. Look at that, not bad. First row joined together.
It's so much less daunting when you start.
Yeah, it is. And it's like any process. If it's a big process, you break it down and you do a little bit every day. And because small things every day will add up to something big in the end.
Wow.
Which is going to add up to a big queen size quilt.
That's going to go on my bed.
No, it's mine. And then we're going to put a border on it to make the king size. So never ending.
I think it still might be mine though.
This is what the cover strip looks like. It's a 2-inch strip that has been prepared with a 1-inch bias tape maker. You can see how the raw edges of the strip are folded over to the back where they meet in the center. Although the strips are made with a bias tape maker, the strips do not have to be cut on the bias grain. They are cut across the fabric from selvage to selvage. Start by giving your fabric a good press using spray starch. This will help the edges to stay crisp and folded. I'm using the same fabric as my quilt backing. However, you can use a different fabric that either blends or contrasts with your backing fabric. So cut 2-inch strips. You'll need 17 for the 25 block quilt that I'm making and 9 for the smaller 12 block quilt. I like to use my June Taylor Shape Cut Plus ruler. It has slots to insert my rotary cutter to make it quick and easy to cut the strips. Now join the strips end to end with a 45-degree diagonal seam. To do this, lay one strip in a horizontal direction on your work surface with the right side facing up. Then place another strip on top in a vertical direction with the right side facing down. Extend the edge of each strip past each other by approximately 1/2 inch, which is usually the width of the selvage. Pin to hold the pieces in place and sew from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. You may find it easier to mark the diagonal line before sewing. So go ahead and continue sewing all the strips together, chaining from one join to the next. When complete, snip the threads, trim the excess fabric back to 1/4 inch, then press the seams open and trim away the excess corners. Now it's time to prepare the cover strips with the 1-inch bias maker. To get started, cut the end of the strip into a point, then thread the strip through the bias maker with the wrong side facing up. Using a pin or a sharp pointed tool, slide the fabric out through the nozzle by about 2 inches or so. Make sure that the side edges of the strips are folded into the center and hold in place with the iron. Slide the bias maker along the ironing board for 4 inches, tilting it up at a 45-degree angle. As the fabric slides out of the bias maker, it will continue to fold the edges to meet in the center on the back of the strip. Slightly lift the iron to move it towards the bias maker, then press it down onto the strip. Continue working in this way, working about 4 inches at a time. The spray starch will help the fabric to hold the creases. I know it's not very classy, but it works. If you don't have a bias maker, you can use 2 pins to make a 1-inch wide channel on your ironing board. You'll need to use the longest pins that you have. I'm using a friction iron-off marking pen to mark the position of the pins. I'm marking 2 dots that are placed 1 inch apart for the first pin and another 2 dots that are spaced 5 inches apart for the second pin. Insert the pins into the ironing board at the dots to make the 1-inch wide channels. Cut the end of the 2-inch fabric strip into a point, Then press the first 6 inches of the strip in half lengthwise with the right sides facing. Open it out, then press the outer edges over to meet in the centre at the crease. Thread the strip through the channel formed by the pins. Working in small sections at a time, place the iron down between the pins, slide the strip through the channel with your left hand and fold the edges of the strip in with your other hand. Lift the iron often to prevent it from scorching the ironing board and be careful to not melt the ends of the pins. If you have a wide iron, just put your pins further apart.
Okay, it's totally up to you if you want to use steam or not. Just make sure that you lift your iron up every couple of inches to make sure that you don't scorch your ironing board cover. And I have to say, disclaimer, sorry if you scorch your ironing board. It's totally up to you if you want to use this method. Make sure you don't melt the pins.
As I make a lot of quilts with the cover strip method, I cheat and use a Simplicity electric bias tape maker.
This is the Simplicity bias tape maker. I said that funny. Okay.
It looks like something from the 80s that you would communicate with your friends on.
Yeah, it's like a radio, it's like a big mobile
bing,
phone.
bing, bing.
These have been out for quite a few years, and a friend of mine gave this to me and I really love it. So when you see how it works, you're going to be quite amazed. And I will say, if you do want to get one of these, if you make a lot of cover strip quilts and you want to get one of these, make sure you purchase it in your country, because the plugs at the end are different.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's Australian. Yep. So let's get started again. And we take this little thing here. Just looks like the bias maker. This, just like so. There we are. And then you just clip that in there. You got to be really careful not to touch this bit because it's very hot.
Oh, is it like an iron thing or something?
It is. Yeah, watch it. You're going to be
like
so amazed.
Straightener.
Yeah, it's like a hair straightener. And then you go.
Wait. That's it?
That's it.
Okay, I'm starting to definitely think I could make a quilt.
Yeah. Okay, so with any bias maker, when it comes to the seam, can be a little bit tricky.
Did it work?
Yeah, it came through
Does it have
nicely.
a pause button in case you get flustered?
Yep.
Oh, okay, good.
But don't keep that on too long because like
It'll
that's
scorch
like a,
it. Oh, so it's
yeah.
like a real, you got to do it. You got to be ready.
You can probably pause for like, a second or two.
For the cover strips, you can also use 1 inch wide pre-made cotton bias binding. However, it should be 100% cotton with raw edges that meet on the center at the back of the strip. Don't be tempted to use poly cotton bias binding as it's too thin, which will make it see-through and stretchy. Step 5 is to sew on the cover strips. From my experience, at this stage, I recommend removing the pinned on numbers just to prevent pin pricks. So let's sew the cover strips onto the top row first. We want the cover strips to finish level with any edge that will be on the outer edge of the quilt and to finish 1/2 inch away from any edge that will be joined to another row. This will reduce the bulk in the joining seams, so take the cover strips and cut 4 16¼ inch lengths. To ensure that the cover strips are centered over the join, draw a line that's 1/2 inch away from the center of the seam on both sides of the seam using a ruler and a marker that can be easily erased from the fabric. Now make a mark that is 1/2 inch away from the bottom of the seam, as this side of the row will be joined to another row. For this step, I'm using a friction marker pen. With this pen, the lines disappear with the heat of the iron. Now these pens were not designed for fabric, and with certain fabrics, they can leave marks. I've tested my pen on a sample by ironing and washing the fabric. When my sample was dry, I also put it in the freezer as a final step to make sure that the lines did not reappear. Disclaimer, if you choose to use a friction pen, make sure you test it on a sample first. The next step is to position the cover strip over the seam. To hold it in place, I'm using Elmer's school glue. I found that applying a line of dots to each side of the seam allowance worked well. Now place the cover strip over the seam in between the marked lines, starting at level with what will be the top edge of the quilt and finishing it at the 1/2 inch mark. Now apply the cover strips over each seam in the same way. So a couple of tips: try to keep the glue within the seam allowance so it doesn't ooze out past the edge of the cover strips, and make sure that the cover strips don't finish more than 1/2 inch away from the edge to ensure that they'll be covered by the cover strip in the crossways seam. Watch out for this, as they can tend to shrink back without you noticing. Roll up the row and head back to the ironing board. Set your iron to no steam and press the cover strips to speed up the drying process. Do this because you don't want to sew through wet glue. Another side note is that there are other ways to hold the cover strips in place. If you have my book, the Quilt-as-you-go Companion, or if you have watched any of my videos before, you may have seen me use fusible web or a sew-line glue pen, or sometimes I just hold them in place and sew. I've heard quilters talk about Elmer's school glue, and so I tested a sample and I can confirm that it washes out, leaves no marks, and the result is a nice soft seam. As mentioned, just make sure that it's dry before you sew. Now it's time to sew on the cover strips. I've changed to a thread that matches the top background fabric in the bobbin, and I recommend having the same thread on top. I have the same quilting needle and the stitch length set at 3. I have my walking foot attached, and I'm swapping out the foot part to the stitch in the ditch foot. I'm now moving the needle position to 1.5. This will move it slightly to the left to give a distance of 2 millimeters, which is slightly less than 1/8 of an inch away from the stitch in the ditch guide. Everyone's machine is different, so if you have a stitch in the ditch attachment for your walking foot, then you can do the same as me. Otherwise, see what feet you have or what feet are available for your machine. You can use an edge stitching foot or a blind hemming foot with the needle position moved slightly to the left. If you don't have one of these feet, use your walking foot or the standard foot. Find a marking on the foot that will give you a guide. Experiment until you find the best way for you and your machine to sew on the cover strips. So let's get sewing. Roll up the row and begin sewing down the right side, aligning the guide with the edge of the cover strip. Start with the back stitch as close as possible to the top. This is important because the thread nest that is sometimes created by the back stitch will be hidden in the horizontal seam allowance, and it will not be visible on the quilt top. Remember, if you do this reverse stitch on the cover strip, the thread nest will unfortunately be visible on the quilt top. So continue sewing, aligning the guide with the edge of the cover strip. When you reach the bottom, finish with a small reverse stitch on the very edge. Turn to the top of the quilt and check that your stitching looks good. If it's loose, you may need to tighten your top tension. Now sew down the right side edge of each cover strip in the same way, rolling up the right side of the row and unrolling the left side of the row as you go. This will help the row move through the machine smoothly without any drag. Turn the section around and sew down the opposite side of the cover strips in the same way. Continue sewing the cover strips over the seams of each row in the same way. For each inner row, make the cover strips finish 1/2 inch away from the top and bottom of the seam. For the bottom row, start the cover strips 1/2 inch away from the top of the seam and finish them level with the bottom of the seam. As I said, those stitching lines just look like quilting lines, sewn 1/2 inch away from the seam, and they're barely noticeable at all.
That was actually really fast.
It was, it was. So now I'm going to go ahead and sew the cover strips onto the remaining rows. So here are all our rows sewn together. In the part 2 video, I'll show you how to join the rows together. You'll also see how the vertical cover strips that finish 1/2 inch shorter are covered by the horizontal cover strips, how to align the stitching lines, and how to handle a large Quilt-as-you-go quilt as it grows. Then in the part 3 video, you'll see how we add a Quilt-as-you-go border to make our quilt measure 100 inches or 2.5 meters square. If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe to Pattern Poole TV for more Quilt-as-you-go inspiration. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye!